Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to the second workshop on Azure Attack. This workshop, as the previous one, is from Mandiant and it was built to walk us through some threat actor TTPs so we can understand some of the methodologies that they use and how do we sort of get our hands on a secret file starting from a compromised user. So we're gonna walk through this step by step. And what I like about this workshop is a couple of things actually. One is that we are going to be utilizing or abusing managed identities. And this is a big part of Azure. Managed identities are a really big part of Azure. And we're going to be learning a few cool tips and tricks on how we can create NSG or firewall rules, how we're going to be doing some port forwarding and some pretty cool tips and tricks as we go throughout this workshop. So in a nutshell, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to start with a compromised user. That user will have read access on a storage blob. From that blob, we're going to get our hands on an SSH key that will allow us to SSH into a box. That box will have a managed identity with certain permissions, and then we will take it from there, from one managed identity to the other, all the way until we compromise a file that is on a storage account, which is supposed to be a secret file or our flag in this instance. Now, as we've done in the previous workshop, this is the shorter version of the video. So in this video, we're going to be focusing mostly on the attack path, the different commands, and I'm going to be alternating between the command prompt and the actual sort of graphical interface or the portal, where we're going to be showing you how it looks like graphically if you're not too comfortable with the command line. So this is going to be the focus of this video. And as we've done in the previous workshop, I'm going to be doing another video a little bit later, the longer version, where we're going to be setting everything up from scratch. So instead of using Terraform to build up the infrastructure and not having a lot of visibility of what is being built up, we're going to avoid doing that. We're going to build everything up ourselves. We're going to set up the managed identities, give them the permissions, set up the resources, assign permissions on them, and then walk through the attack path together. All right, but that's gonna be for another video. For now, let's get started with this attack path and let's see what we're looking at here. So this is basically the GitHub page for the workshop. Again, we're doing the second one. We've done the first one in 2 videos previously. Today we're going to be doing the second workshop, and as you can see, this is the Terraform file and this is the solution. So the solution is provided. You're gonna notice that I'm using maybe slightly modified versions of these commands, how I like to run them, or maybe in a slightly different order, but the idea is going to be pretty much the same. All right, so once you run Terraform and you end up building up the infrastructure, this is what you're gonna have. This is our user, Katie, which is the compromised user. So you can, of course, use that to log in through the portal. The solution assumes maybe that you don't have access to the portal, you're only allowed to use the client, but I'm going to be alternating between both, so you can, if you are more visually inclined, you are more comfortable with the GUIs, you can see what it looks like on the portal. So this is Katie, which is the compromised user, and we can see that Katie has access to a few resources. We have a storage account access, we have a security group access, and we have a public IP, access to a public IP. All right, and basically this is what we're doing, but on the command line. So first and foremost, of course, I want to clear my account context and make sure that I'm not logged in as any other user. And as you can see here, if I do a list, I don't have any active accounts right now, so I'm gonna go ahead and log in as Katie. I'll put the username and the password, which is assumed to be sort of compromised. And here we are, we're logged in. So first thing is, I wanna see what kind of access do I have? What kind of roles do I have as this compromised user, as Katie? So I'm gonna go ahead and run the role assignment command. And you can see here pretty much exactly what we've seen in the portal. I have a storage account contributor role. I have access as a reader to a blob, and I also have reader access to a public IP address. And you're gonna see how this is going to come in handy a little bit later. Now, because I have access to the storage account, let's go ahead and see what is being hosted on this storage account or what's being stored. So I'm gonna go ahead and list the resources. And you can see here that we have a resource group called engineering, and in that resource group we have a storage account called data mining. So if I switch back to the portal, that's exactly what we did using the command line. This is the storage account and this is the resource group. Now if I go into the storage account, you're going to see that I also have a container. And that container is called investment. In that container, I have a file called secret.txt. As Katie, using the portal, I can actually go ahead and download this file. So I can click on it, I can download the file, and if you open it, you'll see that this is an SSH key. I'm going to be doing the same thing using the command line. So first, I'm going to list the containers in my storage account. So the account name here is data mining 01, and I'm listing what containers are available. And you can see the name that we've seen in the portal. There's a container called investment. So this is basically what we've done using the command line. I just sort of browsed into the data mining storage account, and I sort of found out that I have containers, or a container called investment. Now, what's available inside the investment container? Let's go back and figure that out. So here I'm listing what are the blobs that are available in this container that is called investment. And you can see here in the output that I have a file called secret.txt. And that's basically exactly like as if we went into the portal, I click on the container, and I go and see the file that is called secret.txt. Now, of course, I want to download this. We've seen how we do that from the portal, but how do we do that from the command line? Let's go ahead and do that together. So here I'm using the blob download command. And of course, I have to specify the name of the container, the name of the account, and the name of the file or the blob that I want to download. But here I also need to specify something else, which is the authentication mode, because this is not a publicly accessible container or publicly accessible file. I need to be authenticated. So here I'm telling the command that I am authenticated as the user that I'm logged in as right now using the AZ CLI, which is Katie. And that's going to allow me hopefully to download this file. So I run this command and let's validate. If I do get content, and here we go. So I have now the secret key downloaded, and you can see that this is a SSH private key. Great. Now what that means is that hopefully I should be able to use this key to log in into some kind of machine. If you remember, going back to our resources, I have a couple other resources. I have a Linux network security group. So I assume this is security group protecting a Linux VM, and I also have a public IP, which I would also assume this is the public IP of this Linux VM. So first things first, I need to allow myself to be able to SSH into this VM. If there is no firewall rule that is allowing me to do that, I wouldn't be able to SSH. So if I go into the security group, I can actually see the inbound and outbound rules, the firewall rules. And there is no rule here that specifies that I am allowed to SSH into this VM. So I'm going to have to add my own IP address to allow myself to SSH. So from the portal, basically this is how you would do it. If you go into inbound security rules, click on add, and you should be able to allow yourself access or to SSH into that VM. Now, what am I SSHing to? Or what's the public IP address? Basically, from the portal, this is it. You click on the public IP and you'll be able to see the IP address. So this is what it looks like from the portal. Let's see how we can do that from the CLI. Now, let's actually, before we do that, let's see what happens if I try to SSH. So here I am, and I apologize, I'm using Kali, but that's the easiest VM I found with everything set up with the AZ CLI installed and whatnot. So here, if I try to SSH before I add the firewall rule, so I have the SSH key here and I try to SSH into the VM. The Azure user, by the way, this is the default user that gets created with the VM. You see that nothing's happening. I'm not getting any response because I cannot reach the VM on port 22 on the SSH port. So I'm going to have to go back and add a firewall rule. And this is what it looks like from the CLI. First and foremost, I have to list the rules. What rules are available? And you can see there isn't much over there. It's just the default rules, nothing that was added by any user. So I'm going to have to go and add a rule. Now, obviously, I have the permissions to do that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to add a rule. And this is a fairly long command. To avoid any typos, I'm just going to copy and paste this. And what this is saying is, allow my source IP address to the destination port of 22 on that VM. So that's going to take a while, and we can see eventually that it succeeded. And you can actually validate this. If you go back to the portal, you'll be able to see that. We'll do that in a second. Let me do this from the CLI first, since we're here. So I'm going to list the rules again, and here we go. You can see now that there's a new rule from my source allowing access to TCP port 22. And if I go back to the portal, this is what it looks like. Going back to the security group, you can see that there is a new rule that was added called my NSG rule. And you can see that it's allowing access to TCP port 22. Brilliant. So now I should be able to SSH into that VM. Let me go back to my Linux box, and I'm going to try to SSH, and here we go. Fantastic. So now I'm logged in to the Linux VM. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting for me. I absolutely love managed identities in Azure, and we are going to start abusing managed identities. If you're not too familiar with what these are, the easiest way to think about them, and this might not be technically 100% accurate, but this just because I don't want to go into too many details of what it is, just think of it as for now, as a service account for this VM. All right. There's different types of managed identities, and there's a lot more details to it, but I don't want to get into that. So for now, just think that this Linux VM has a service account, and obviously this service account or this managed identity, so let's stick to the correct terminology, this managed identity will have certain permissions. So this is one thing. The other thing is that I will be allowed to log in as this managed identity as long as I am on this VM. Because I managed to SSH into the Linux box, you'll see that I can log in as the managed identity. Now, of course, this assumes that a managed identity has been created in the first place. We will see how to do that in the second video, the longer version. So I'm gonna stop going into way too many details here. Let's recap these last 2 minutes. We logged into the VM, the Linux VM. This VM has a managed identity, and that's gonna now allow me to log into this managed identity. So this is what I'm doing right now. I'm logging in as the managed identity onto the Linux VM. This managed identity has certain roles assigned to it, otherwise we cannot use it. So let's see what roles does this managed identity have. So I'm going to list the role assignment, and you can see it has a contributor role over another VM, another Windows VM this time. Great. So that means that in theory, using this managed identity that I have logged into, I should be able to take control over that Windows VM. Let me show you what that looks like in the portal. So here, if you notice, I'm using the admin account because Katie does not have access to the Windows VM. So remember the chain. So far, the path has been, we compromised the user for Katie. From there on, we managed to log into a Linux VM. This Linux VM has a managed identity with contributor access over a Windows VM. So Katie does not have access to the Windows VM. The managed identity has. All right. So if you go to the Katie portal, you're not going to be able to see the Windows VM. If you remember, we were able to see only 3 resources. So here, I just want to show you what that looks like. So I'm logged in as the admin. And you can see that the Linux VM here, if I go to identity, it has a managed identity enabled. And if we look at the role assignments, this is basically what we've seen in the client. But from the portal side, this is what it looks like. There's a contributor role for this identity over a Windows VM. Now, here's what we're going to be doing in the next step. Let me show you in the portal first, and then we're going to go back to the client. If I go to the Windows VM, there's a feature in Azure called the run command. And that basically, that's exactly what the name says. It will allow you to run scripts inside that VM, which is a very handy tool for troubleshooting, also a very handy tool to run malicious commands. So one thing that we're going to be doing in the client is we're going to run the IP config to figure out what the private IP address of this VM is, because this VM is not accessible publicly. So we're going to have to access it from the Linux box. We're going to have to figure out what the private IP of the Windows VM is and then access it. We're going to do that in the client, but from the portal, this is what it looks like. So if I just go and run this command, and here I'm speeding up the video a little bit because these commands take a while to run. This is what the output looks like. So you can see the private IP. So let's go back to the client. I'm logged in as the managed identity. Remember, the managed identity has the contributor access, so pretty much full access over the virtual machine. Here is what I want to do. First and foremost, I'm going to add a user. Then I'm going to give this user full local admin access over the Windows VM so I can completely take over it. And then I'm going to have to get the IP address, the private IP address, so I can RDP into the Windows VM. So let's do these. Step one, and again here I'm just copy pasting these commands so I would avoid doing typos. If you've joined me in any live workshop or live training, you would see that I am a terrible typer and I always do typos. So I'm just gonna copy this, and basically what this is saying is use the run command, the same run command that we've seen in the portal, but here what I'm doing is I'm adding a user called Tariq. And once this finishes running and completes successfully, I'm going to elevate the user Tariq and add it to the local administrators group. Once that finishes, fantastic, now I have full admin access. All I need is still the IP address or the private IP address, so I'm just going to run the ipconfig command, and here we go. I have the IP address over here. Great, so now that means I should have full access over the Windows VM. But before I sort of start going through the trouble of getting RDP access to it, because this VM is not publicly accessible, so I'm gonna have to do a little bit of port forwarding and log into it and access it through the Linux VM. So before I do that, let me see if it's going to be a useful step for me. Let's figure out what permissions does this VM has. Well, first and foremost, if it has a managed identity, and if it does, what kind of permissions does this identity have? So let me switch back to the portal, and I'm gonna go back to the Windows VM this time. Let's check the identity option, and we can see that there is a managed identity enabled. Fantastic. So that means if I access this VM, I should be able to log in as the Windows VM managed identity, pretty much like we did with the Linux box. Now, what roles does this identity have? Let's check. And you can see here that it has access to a storage account. Great. Maybe, so it's the same storage account, but maybe I have access to more files or more containers or blobs on this storage account. So let's go ahead and figure this out together. Now you'll notice here if I go to the networking setting, there are no inbound or outbound rules. And this VM does not have a public IP address. It only has a private IP address. So now that I know that this VM has better access to the storage account, I want to get on it. And I want to use it to access the storage account. But the challenge is there is no public IP. So I cannot RDP directly into the VM. What I'm gonna have to do is do a little bit of port forwarding. So to do that, I'm gonna terminate the SSH connection and then re-establish it. But what I'm doing this time is I'm using SSH with port forwarding. Now that's done, I'm gonna open another tab and I'm going to RDP to the local machine on the port that I forwarded, which is the RDP port. And you can see here a couple other settings. I'm enabling clipboard, the sort of resolution. That's not a big deal. What we're more concerned about is the user and the password that I've created earlier using the run command. This is what's allowing me to RDP into the machine. And with that, you see that RDP is opened and I am able to log into the machine. So I'm gonna get rid of these default settings very quickly. And let's validate actually if I do have local admin access. So if I go into users, and into my information, I can see that I have local admin account. Fantastic. So here's what we know so far. I have access to the Windows VM. This Windows VM, as we've seen in the portal, has a managed identity. And this managed identity has access to the storage account. Pretty much like what we've done with the Linux box, I want to log in as this managed identity. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And let me list my role assignments. And as you can see here, this is the storage account that I have access to. So similar to what we've done in the Linux box, I'm going to start to list this account and the resources inside this account. So let's go ahead and see what shares are available in this account. You can see here there's a share called engineering data. And basically, if we go back to the portal, this is what we're doing. I'm going into the storage account, but this time, instead of going to containers, I am going to another resource that I have access to, which is the file shares. So I'm listing the file shares. Katie does not have access to this. The managed identity for the Windows VM does. So as the Windows VM managed identity, now I have access to this file share called engineering data. What's inside the engineering data? Well, let's figure it out. So I'm going to list the files inside the engineering data. And you can see there's a file called super secret file. Obviously, I want to download this file, right? So from the portal, this is what it looks like. I'm going into the file share, I'm going to the file, and I'm downloading the file. Now I can do something similar in the portal, but first I have to provide an access key. So I have to prove that I'm authorized to download this file. And this access key can be found here in the portal. You can see this is what it looks like. From the client, I'm gonna have to list the access key first. So let me go ahead and grab the access keys. And these are the access keys that we've seen in the portal. And now I have all the parameters that I need to download the file. I have the name of the storage account, I have the name of the file share, I have the name of the file, and I have the access key. So let us put this together. And again, this is one of these long commands that I'm just going to copy paste here to avoid any typos. That you can see here, the name of the file that I want to download, the name of the share name, the name of the account, and the access key. And hopefully this is going to work. And here we go. If I list the content, you can see that the super secret file has been downloaded. And if you look at the content of the file, you can see a congratulations message. So let us recap very quickly what we've done today. We started with a user called Katie that is the compromised user. This user allowed us to access a blob storage. That blob has an SSH key. This SSH key allows us access to a Linux VM, but before we're able to access the Linux VM, we need to do two things. First, allow ourselves access to SSH, so we changed the firewall rules, or we added a firewall rule. And second, we grabbed the public IP address. Once we got access to the Linux VM, we were able also to log in as the managed identity of the Linux VM. And the managed identity of the Linux VM has permissions over the Windows VM, which allows us to utilize the run commands. So we ran some commands, we added ourselves as a local user or a local administrator, that is, and then we logged into the Windows VM. Once we RDP into the Windows VM, we also see that the Windows VM has a managed identity, and that managed identity for the Windows VM has access to a shared file, which is our super secret file. We were able to grab the access keys and then download the super secret file. And with that, we would have reached the end of our video today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. As I mentioned, there is going to be a longer version of this video where we're going to be setting up the infrastructure from scratch. The focus of this video was not the infrastructure, but the attack path and the kill chain, how we managed to get all the way from the Katie user all the way to the super secret file. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to set up all of this, how to create the storage account, how to create the managed identities, give them permissions, access, so on and so forth. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon in another video.